recorded, and I'm looking forward to giving us a kind of overview again of some of the introductory aspects of NVivo and talking specifically about 3 sample projects that NVivo has provided us to consider how NVivo can be used. Sorry, I keep on clicking share instead of slideshow. All right. Since this is being recorded and people might see this later on, I wanted to thank my mom. My mom, was a physicist, and it's because of her that my family came to the United States, right? Because of her intellectual potential, and I really admire that. My dad and my sisters also love me, so that's nice to say that about them too. And I guess since then, I've been really fortunate, right, to have a broad and diverse career working with some really exceptional scholars who've guided my framework for thinking about these issues. Social theorist named Patricia Clough, who was a graduate center sociologist. She really taught me to think at the limits of social thought, and I really think that, both conceptually and in application, we all should be trying to achieve that. So it's really nice to have the opportunity, right, to also work on presenting and sharing how to think about and use a software that was released this year, and right, our knowledge about this is real, actual, social and cultural capital. And that's exciting, so thank you, Patricia, for that. And also, I had really the opportunity to work with other social scientists like Mitch Denier, who taught me about qualitative research. Mitch Denier wrote Sidewalk, and I'm really inspired by teaching his work over and over again to my students about what qualitative research is. And so, with them and others, I feel really great about, putting these conceptual and application-based ideas together in an introduction that hopefully can teach us how to use NVivo in a really critical and meaningful way. All right. This is something I share with all of my classes as we begin, the idea of defining the situation, which is a concept in sociology, about how, as social interaction occurs, individuals take steps to do what sociologists call define the situation. Just the way that this room is set up, but also in kind of how they frame the discussion and conversation, which I guess I have begun to do. But I would like to be conscious of that specifically, all right? Last time we talked a little bit about the emergence and resurrection of a praxis of land acknowledgements and an intervention in the form of standpoint statements. I was talking about the idea of land acknowledgements more broadly in general as something, right, that has kind of entered the progressive discourse as a way of beginning to reflect on the history of, the political economy of knowing and being, and its ties to colonization and violence, etc. Not funny, but that became a kind of discourse, and lots of institutions and universities have been reflecting on this, thinking, hey, is it sufficient, right, just to say in the beginning of when we start, right, that this space used to be occupied by other people who this space, right, was taken from in a violent and brutal way, and that we benefit from it by being able to learn here. I guess that is really important and meaningful, and lots of discussion has happened around that, but I also think that it might be important to kind of also locate ourselves when we are in conversation. Oftentimes the speaker, right, has a very different social position from the audience. And I guess I don't want us to forget that, right? Last time I talked about, right, the kind of work as a graduate student and otherwise, right, that one might do in order to earn income. And those things might bring you valuable and meaningful experience in different kinds of research, which it has for me. I don't want to focus on my standpoint too much today, but I guess I wanted to address that as something for you to think about too as you enter a conversation, what your standpoint is and how that might shape the dynamic there. I also have a concept called literacies of praxis that I work with in all of my courses. The idea of literacies of praxis came from my training in and professional development in various kinds of pedagogical movements and best practices. The idea that students can have various kinds, have and should have different kinds of literacies, right? That they should decide how to apply and use, which is where the idea of praxis comes in. I try to share a little bit about the knowledge that I've gained, the scientific knowledge about those areas of learning so that students might be able to reflect a little bit on those by, for example, sharing a framework for information literacy by the American College of Research Librarians, and having students reflect on what those components are of that frame, and where they might improve one of those components of their frame. I don't know, that's the kind of deep learning I want to do in my classes, where students are learning about the kind of knowledge they should have and what kind of praxis they can gain by acquiring that kind of knowledge. That generally leads us to thinking about writing and scholarship that has been produced by different social scientists generally that identify and articulate themes around the personal as political, and how to both represent your lived experience in the context of broader, more generalizable knowledge, and how to be critical of your experience and of the generalizable knowledge in a productive and complex way. All right. And actually here I've linked in these slides that should be available for you an introduction to standpoint and standpoint theory that I do, which helps kind of frame some of that discourse. Okay. But today I want to just highlight a brief set of points about framing qualitative research methods in the social sciences. All right. I guess teaching students about qualitative and quantitative research, I guess one of the things that really is kind of a false dichotomy is that quantitative research is about numbers and qualitative research is about everything else, right? Which it is to some extent, and we do need to teach the students about how to read numbers and how to understand them, and also to conceptualize them and what demographic data really means. How they also fall within that framework of the demographic data, right? And how demographic data shows that there are real life differentials in the experiences that people have and the outcomes that they experience based on things like their sex, gender, race, class, etc. Right? And that can be measured in many different ways. All right. I guess I want us to conceptualize qualitative research as using non-standard units of measure. Right? Standard units of measure allow us to see the kind of degree of difference between any two pieces of information. Right? 2 is 2 times 1. And so, right, 2 is going to be double what 1 is, and that's the difference that can show us the degree of difference between any 2 points of information. Right? Qualitative analysis in units of measure that are not standard, that are not able to speak to each other, right, are going to tell us other kinds of things. They're going to tell us what the researcher has no idea about first. And in many ways, that might help us move on to the second point about framing anti-positivist and positive approaches to social life. Right? Positivist approaches suggest that we can study social life just like the natural sciences can study the body. Right? Although the natural sciences are also modeling kind of ways that they believe, right, these systems work. Even though they're very material in the sense that we all have bodies and organs inside of us, too. So how and why do we need non-standard units of measure? All right, sorry, I was getting into the framing of the anti-positivist and positivist approaches to researching social life. Well, anti-positivists suggest that, hey, we don't have to study everything in ways that give us things that can be compared like to like. We might just want to gather information. Right? We might want to gather as much information as we can, because we might not always be able to see what's out there until we gather lots of information and look at it together. Right? So qualitative analysis in some ways, right, is specifically for being able to identify questions, right, in addition to being able to ask them. And so, yes, qualitative analysis, right, has a lot of implications for interpretive research, right? Meaning research where you're trying to figure out what your question is in the process of doing it. Today, we might want to think more about metadata, All right, and before the session, I was describing my experience of learning maybe how to use a library, right, in the 90s, right, and like late 80s, early 90s, and to think right about that as a time when like databases were emerging, right, in like libraries and public schools, right? Oops, sorry, and learning about how to do strategic searching, right, as a way of identifying texts and ideas of interest. And I guess that kind of required a certain set of skills within a certain like kind of set of a limited framework, right? Of like a set number of texts that exist that isn't exponentially changing, you know, in real time. I guess I would like to encourage people to still, right, like work on learning those critical research skills in kind of trial and error and kind of putting your terms in and identifying, right, like different texts and reading the abstracts, and going back to that. And NVivo is going to help us do that in some ways, right? And NVivo is going to help us take on some of the challenges of metadata, right? And just the vast amount of information, right? The vast amount of information in addition to just our standard academic texts as well, right? That might be kind of aggregated in order to understand the relationships between, yes, the standard academic texts, any other kinds of data like interview, hypothetically social media data, hypothetically also data related to how the project is being managed, right? And also, different kind of systems and tools for summarizing the data, right? And being able to reflect on the data and return to the data in ways that are hopefully helpful in you executing your project in the long term, right? As you begin to code your data for themes, you might be writing memos about those themes, right? And those memos might end up becoming part of the text of your paper, article, poster, you know, whatever representation of your project you're gonna end up sharing with an audience. But I guess, yes, metadata exists in a meta world that we are going to enter through NVivo a little more today. All right. More broadly, as we think about what goes into NVivo, all right, we might want to think about, you know, different qualitative data collection and analytic techniques, right? So a lot of the qualitative data and analytic techniques are going to use some form of interview or ethnographic data, or perhaps survey data. Right. Sorry, do you have your hand up, or did anyone? No. Okay, just wanted to check. Okay. I guess I also wanted to be able to identify interviews and ethnography as both attitudinal and observational research, right? And to think about kind of what the two add, right? Attitudinal data tells us what people think about kind of anything, right? But observational data tells us what the observer sees in the social field that he or she or they are observing, right? So a number of researchers really advocate for mixed methods research, right, to kind of limit the biases and limitations of one or the other. One of my favorite kind of paradoxes in sociology is thinking about how people say things differently than they do them. And in thinking about these kinds of contradictions, right? Like in a number of kinds of areas, a scholar named Anne Morning, who is a scholar of race at NYU, writes about racial conceptualization, right? How people think about what race is, and how race works, and how and why there's racial difference. Identifies that if you ask questions about race, these questions about these topics to college students, right, in different ways, they're going to give us responses that show the malleability of racial conceptualization, meaning that racial conceptualization, when When prompted to engage in racial conceptualization in different ways, students demonstrate, and individuals more broadly demonstrate that conceptualization varies at times simply based on how they are asked questions about what race is. Right? And not just like leading questions like this is what race is or this is what race is, but things like if they're asked an open-ended question or a closed-ended question, if they're given comparisons with certain racial groups versus adding another group, something like that, right? If the difference that's being observed is positive or negative, right? There are different kinds of ways that sorry.
Or like if they come out of an interaction that's been manufactured, like an experimental.
Sure. Yes. Part of the three kinds of ways that they were asked, right? They were asked a closed-ended question that is kind of a standard question from other research studies. There's races there are different species or different race. There are different species or different races in the species. There are different races in the species Homo sapiens or something like that, right? Like it was a standard question that had been asked in other capacities, and the author cited that, right? Like in the ways that one of our participants here is, right, focusing on research that has already been done about a topic to kind of, amend that work in some way and add a new layer or framework. So you might, use that same phrasing if 1,000 people have been asked the question that way already, and that has been written about by 5 or 6 different scholars. But I guess that was just an example, right, of ways that people, so how people think about what race is and tell an interviewer what they think of race is varies if they're asked an open-ended question, a closed-ended question, and if they're given examples. They were kind of, it was kind of like an experiment. They were given different examples of real-life racial differentials, and they were asked to explain them. And there were kind of contradictory ways in which they were explained if the differential was positive versus negative. So the differentials were about birth weight, right? So what explains, right, why there's a difference in average birth weight for babies of different races, right? And then there was another question that was given, what explains the overrepresentation of African Americans in the NFL? Right? So that one was positive, right? I guess it's complex, so there are different ways that people attach to a positive versus a negative differential and explain them. But there were other major themes that were identified that were consistent, like some ideas of Black biological superiority, as underlying racial notions of racialization in our society, right? So anyway, one example, right, that people say things differently than they do them. People think they know what race is, but then they kind of use that concept in different ways, just even when they're asked the question differently. So how do they use it in their real life, right? And also another really great example of this is an article called, Saying Meritocracy, Doing Privilege, right? Where Seamus Khan, another sociologist at Columbia, or he might be at a different institution. But anyway, he's doing this research at a boarding school where he's asking students about what explains kind of their success, right? And the students at the boarding school, there are a number of there are different kinds of empirical evidence that suggests that the students' long-term success is due to their to the social capital that they gain and then the cultural capital that they gain at this elite institution. Because yes, the students at St. Paul's, right, go to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, they finish in the lower half of their classes, right, but earn more than their peers who finished in the top half of their classes do, right, in their disparate fields. And the students are, because they're trained to also talk about themselves and all the stuff that they do and all the work that they're doing, they are really trained to think that they work really hard, right, to achieve their privilege in society, right? And I guess to some extent, right, maybe we all do that too, right? So I guess, not saying and doing the same thing is maybe not exclusive to only some people, and maybe part of the condition of being human. But how do you study that, I guess, is, and I don't want to get too lost in this discussion here, but just kind of conceptualizing, right, both what people think, right, and what people do, and how that can be measured in qualitative data in using these two methods and others. When we're looking at ethnography, but also interview, we might be thinking about field study, right? What is the site? And how are we gathering our data about that site, right? Through collecting notes. And I guess, right, maybe one way of doing qualitative data analysis might be gathering notes and hand coding those notes by perhaps doing something like taking a different color highlighter, right, for different themes, right, and going over your notes. Perhaps it could be writing kind of your own codes in the margins, right, like, I don't know, let's say I'm doing my boarding school interview coding. I write, you know, MER for statements about meritocracy. And then I kind of go through, right, and see, hey, what were the different kind of statements, right, about meritocracy over time? Are there common, like, ways that students described what I'm categorizing as meritocracy, right? And then maybe I have a PR, you know, PRV, there's code for privilege, right? I guess often you take vowels out of the codes, right? But like the mayor seemed like, I don't know if that worked. But it could be MRT also. So, right, then I also, I guess, this is just to explain how if we were to do this, we'd do this by hand to see where we can identify maybe them coming together, right? Because we're saying, oh, why are they contradicting each other here, potentially? Or wait, maybe one student actually like had a lot of nuance, right? And so I have a lot of the codes like all next to each other because that student, right, actually was talking about those two things together, right? And right, I'd have to make some of those judgments about it, and I'd have to, right, then kind of flip through all my transcripts and waste some paper, but you know, that could be a way to do it, yeah, and some people still do that. My colleague Marissa Tremontino in the sociology department, right, hand codes the work that she works with. I guess it depends also on a number of factors like your sample size, right? The larger your sample, right, the more likely that the more labor intensive it's going to be to hand code your work, and also not only just to hand code your work, but also to be able to review and analyze those codes in a broader structural way. So meta-analytic tools are needed in a digital society. We kind of talked a little bit about this already, so I'll move on. All right, what questions and approaches are facilitated by analytic software? We discussed the idea of interpretive research or exploratory research and modeling, right? So more broadly, right, this analytic software is going to allow us to do way more than we need to do, all right, to kind of model lots of possibilities. But I guess, right, that also is kind of what then the work will be, is going through all those models and like kind of identifying what works or makes sense for you, right? And what new ideas come out of this that then you can focus on or try to address. And again, also the idea is that maybe you don't know everything about like how people are expressing their ideas about reproductive rights and the use of different kinds of prescriptions, you know. Maybe you have assumptions, right? But like maybe as you are systematically looking at this information, a few things are revealed to you that are contradictions that maybe you didn't anticipate, right? And I guess the goal is to find them and to be open to them. And yeah, they're like, I think that maybe the richest things that you might find, right, are things that you weren't expecting, right? Because if you already know the answer, right, then it probably doesn't make sense, right, to be asking your question. So again, this software is going to help us in some ways to do exploratory research and modeling. I guess literature reviews themselves, all right, are a part of doing that exploratory work, right? And so because this software is going to allow us to analyze text and to kind of create linkages between the texts, right, and other aspects or elements of your project, right, the literature review is going to be exploratory in nature by allowing you to explore connections within the text itself and within how you're thinking about the project also. All right, so other kinds of approaches that are facilitated are content analysis models, right? So what kind of content? Right, so I guess anything from interview data, which is people talking, right, to maybe like metadata that is the data from social media downloaded by, you know, I don't know, either a third party, a data provider, or other kinds of technical information, right, that may not be kind of as intuitive as a set of statements made by an individual, right? So, right, whereas reading an interview transcript, right, like you should be able to synthesize that more intuitively. There might be kinds of data like, I don't know, sets of receipts, right? Memos or other things that you're looking for patterns in, right? Besides just what people said, right? Laws, for instance, right? Newspaper articles, but other like obscure things, maybe like legal contracts or right other artifacts, sorry, in society, all right, that represent kind of the gross amount of information out there, right? And not just out there, but part of a system called the global information economy, right? So any kind of information, right, that we want to gather some kind of patterns or connections from, right? We'll look at some of the meta-analytic functions and approaches too, but I guess we could also keep in mind certain limitations, including, I guess, right, like a certain amount of expertise that is a barrier for some people, right? Also access to the software, right, which is a barrier for a number of people as well. Time and energy that is involved, right, in kind of setting up the whole project too, right? All right, so here's like what we came to learn about, which is a little bit about NVivo, right? And we talked about these ideas in the last session too, but we're gonna review some of them now. Here are the core elements of the program, right? Here are the things that like are essential to how you're able to input, organize, and analyze data, right? So there are different categories, all right? And we'll look at the program in a little bit and see the tabs and how they're organized, right? But the tabs are going to list things like files, right? You're going to have files. You're going to first create a project, right? Within that project, right, you'll have files. Those files may be your data files, right? They might be files of memos that you wrote about that data, right? There might be a list of your subjects, right? There might be also, right, the texts that are in your literature review, right? Or texts that like are either texts you already read, texts that you want to read, right? That might help kind of develop like the framework or analysis of your project. You might have images, right? You might have videos. You might have audio, right? Any kind of, right, like of files that are going to be associated with your project have to be organized in some way, right? And here are some ways that like these files might be organized, or some aspects or elements of those that are going to help us use the functions of NVivo to both analyze and visualize this data, right? One will be codes, right? And codes will be different categories, right, or topics or ideas that you're either looking for in the literature or in the data that you're analyzing, right? And we'll look at some of the examples, but one of the examples that we'll look at is a analysis of a survey of high school alumni from a college preparatory school for women from the 50s to 70s or something around around that time period. All right. So some of the codes, all right, are the purpose of the purpose of this project is a survey that is kind of analyzing alumni experiences. All right. A number of the people in the survey wrote about their long commutes to school. All right. And the kind of amount of homework that they had. Right. And so, right, like if I was a researcher who was gathering the data from, and I believe it was a survey, like a written survey, right, I might be looking at the responses in these written surveys and then seeing, well, how many of them talked about commute time, right? And I might want to code, right, like all the surveys so that I can identify where in the survey there's a discussion of commute time. But also, I just might want to know what the prevalence is of the discussion of commute time, right? Like, what percentage of these interviews, all right, are spent discussing commute time? How often is commute discussed? You know, but I guess, right, how often commute is discussed, all right, is something that maybe like is that other software platforms could provide you, right? But like the percentage of time in which commute is discussed, right, is kind of what NVivo is more designed to do, right? So yeah, what percentage of the transcript, right, on average, from each of the respondents is spent discussing transportation, right? What percentage of the transcript is coded by more than one code? Right. What percent of the transcript discussion is coded by transport and homework? Right. What percent of transcripts are coded by transport and not being able to play with my friends? Right. And kind of, right, like, so what were the key themes related to transport? But also something like, if people talked about not being able to play with their friends, they always talked about transportation, right? Because they always talked about the commute, right? In addition to discussing that they weren't able to play with their friends, like where they lived, as opposed to their hour-and-a-half commute to their preparatory school, and yeah. Right. And I guess that kind of nuance, right, like might be important for some reason. All right. They could have been asked separate questions, right, about like how did going to this school affect your relationship with the people that you knew in the neighborhoods where you lived versus the people at this school. Right. So codes, all right, are different kinds of ways that you are able to tag the files themselves or elements of those files, and or references. Any of the kind of information that you put is going to be organized potentially by these codes. Right. And we'll look at kind of, for the literature review sample, they provide some ideas of like sample codes that might be used with a literature review. Right. And why, to kind of give us a concrete kind of way to visualize using those codes. All right. Cases. All right. So cases are going to be within your data. Let's say you have a file folder, all right, with all of your interviews in them. All right. So in this case, a case is going to be each interview subject is a case. Right. So your cases, right, are the kinds of within your data, right, the different, either the different subjects, right, or the different kind of pieces of content that you are analyzing together. And one reason that, like, and so part and D classifications, all right, or attributions are often ways in which the cases can then further be coded individually to maybe represent individual attributes like the demographic characteristics of each respondent. Right. So that later on you could go back, right, and say, I want to look at all of the respondents who were male, right, and generate that information separately from all the respondents that were female. Right. Or I want to look at all the respondents who went to the school from 1969 to 1972, all right, because those students were telling us about like some thing that happened at the school that was traumatic. Right, and we want to kind of be able to identify what they were saying about that, right? And understand that for whatever reason. Now, I guess, right, like maybe, why do you think a school would be doing an alumni survey in the first place?
To just see whether their students succeeded.
Yeah, the school might have enough of a reputation, right, that like telling people about whether or not their alumni succeeded, right, could be potentially beneficial for the school. What else?
Or to like see what they could, like if the alumni speak on things that were difficult for them during their.
Yeah, yes. Usually the school wants to get money, okay? And so, right, the school is and I need to right, so I guess there, and I might pause. Do you want to pause the record for a second? Sorry. I guess Bard gives me a weird trial Zoom, so I just have to relog in.
Presentation video cut off right where you say, schools want.
Right, money. Right, so I just need to relog in. Sorry, I didn't think about that. Anyway, so yes, I guess, right, we're thinking about what their goal is, right, in producing this this survey and the analysis, right? So maybe they do want to know about the traumatic event that happened, right? But maybe they just like want to know, right, like how they can encourage people to donate money to the school. It could be some of those things, and I don't remember honestly, because I don't know if the school's still open, and also the school used to be an all-girls school and then became a co-ed school, so maybe it is still open, but so it wasn't 100% clear. And also the sample projects, like interestingly enough, like they're de-identified a little bit, and some of them will only use non-copyrighted material, so like, right, like they've kind of like hollowed out some parts of their sample projects also, but so we can't like, yeah, so it's a little bit like, you know, kind of, it's artificial in that way, but yeah. Okay, cool.
Alumni search on LinkedIn is really important.
Okay.
You know, for professional purposes, just networking.
Yes.
Current students with students that have been placed in the field. You can find them anywhere in the country.
I went to college at Gallatin, which is the individualized study school at NYU. And on the 12th, there's a winter soiree for Gallatin. And it's actually hosted by Christy Turlington, who went to Gallatin also.
Wow.
And this woman, Sarah Moonves, who was like my writing partner in my freshman year writing class, who's the editor of W Magazine, right? So yes, it kind of makes sense to maybe follow through with your alumni connections.
You know, we're celebrities.
Yes, yeah. So that'll be a fun party, yes. Yeah. All right. Totally, there's CUNY celebrities also. I think Queen Latifah went to BMCC, and, sorry? But maybe didn't finish, I don't know, and some people, yeah. So yes, totally. CUNY is like New York School, right? Like,
yeah.
Yes. Okay, are you recording again? Yeah, okay, perfect, great. All right, so we watched these two videos last time about what NVivo does and importing data into NVivo. Maybe we won't watch them well, let's just watch the what NVivo does, because it was helpful. I also was able to like kind of point out things like the codes and classifications and some of those elements in how the video represents the program. All right, so this is the NVivo logo with the 4 kind of diamonds together. All right. So here, right there, identifying kind of what hand coding looks like. Right. And all right, so data is going to be identified in these files folders up there in that first file section, right? So, but also like the files are going to be classified, and you're going to organize your files, all right, into something like transcripts, memos, administrative, grant documents, etc. Right? Then you're going to want to code, all right, the kind of different parts, all right? So maybe you're going to develop codes for your literature review first, right? For the key themes in your study, right? Those codes might then be the codes that you use to code your transcript with also, but you might add more codes, right? And so see here, like when you are running these queries, right? For specific codes, for specific parts of your data, right? It's going to give you information about, yeah, how much that code has been covered in your data that you are viewing, right? And again, so right, it's going to take a lot of setting up, all right, for you to be able to do that, right? But I guess the process of setting up, right, like is kind of also the process of managing your project, right, through identifying key themes, right, which are the codes, right? And different ways to classify, all right, the cases of your study, right? So that, right, the codes are like kind of the ideas and themes that you're looking for, right? And the cases, right, are the kind of sets of data that you're using to look for those themes. So both you can look for the themes in all the data, right? But then you might want to look for the themes, right, by kind of classifying that data in different ways, right? So I want to look at the alumni from this year's, right? Or I want to look at articles that were published in this journal, right? Or I want to look at articles that are, written in these years, all right, something like that, right? Because if your part of your data, right, is the articles in your literature review, right, then ways to classify it might include things like the year. But also, I don't know if that I think the classifications, I'm sure that like there are standard ones that are classifying demographic aspects of the cases, right? And just like that, there are, like the year of the article is going to be a standard kind of classification. But there might be other things that you might be specifically hoping to kind of tag in your cases. All right. Let's see. I want to kind of also check the time so I have an idea of where we're at. Okay. It's 2:44, which I did not realize. All right. I'm gonna show you. I want to like at least show you the literature review of the first sample project, because I know we don't really have very much time left, right? And I sent these out also, right? So you have them to look on at your own, right?
So these, do you mean like the samples?
Yeah, these samples, yes. So in the email that I sent out earlier, it kind of explains what the samples are, and it links these PDFs to. So the sample projects, right, are kind of files that you look at in NVivo, so you wouldn't be able to look at the sample project file. But I printed out kind of the first project has a little bit of an overview of the literature review and kind of, how the steps they took and some things. I'm going to show you a couple of things right now. But then the other two are the reports that were produced using NVivo, so which will feature kind of some of the kinds of figures and graphs, right, like for the alumni survey report, and then the other report is a larger study on well-being in, I think, older, like an older population. Okay, so here in this sample, all right, which is a literature.
What I'm saying is we can't see you.
Oh, sorry. I think that's because wait, I'm out of. I think it's because of the screen share. I was sharing one screen, and I think I can. I'll maybe I can.
Yeah, you share
Okay. All right. All right. So in this table, like, which is not the NVivo product, they're just saying that like there are, because the number of people, right, are using EndNote or another. Sorry. Maybe RefWorks, or there are a couple of different kinds of, right, like citational softwares, including EndNote. So people might be using that already, or Zotero, right? So there are ways in which you can like download that information from those other citational softwares. Right? Oftentimes they'll like allow you to click right next to the entries, and then they'll give you their own like kind of Word document version of the citations linked there. So here it's just describing, right, there are ways to import the data from other citational softwares that you might be using, right? Here on so here this person's describing that they went to a conference, they started writing memos, they started writing a blog post. These are all the different kinds of files that they were adding into their project, right? They were searching for literature on VR and health specifically, right? That was their theme and topic, right? So first they were pulling in those 25 open access articles into their files, right, and to a folder probably labeled literature open something, literature for project or first literature search, and then using the codes, all right, they were identifying in this literature, right, these specific aspects or elements, right, and they suggest that these, right, are, if for any literature review, the kinds of codes that you might want to include, all right, to analyze the literature that you have available. In a way that's going to help you, right, come up with, I don't know, the kinds of approaches that are going to help you come up with a project, and a project that you want to, right, ask really critical and meaningful questions with. Right? So the codes that are identified are definitions, right? So that you would go through your literature, right, and highlight key concepts as definitions. Right? You would highlight good quotes, maybe things, right, that were really like kind of explanatory, things that were really in depth, things that were really clear, things that were evocative, right? That's kind of oftentimes, right, what people are usually doing when they're writing a paper is they're kind of like pulling out the good quotes, right? So this is kind of a way, right, of you kind of being able to highlight that so that you can grasp them together. What sections of these articles are referring to methods? Right. So yes, both, right, you're kind of coming up with concepts, all right, that you're going to use in your project, but also you're coming up with a way to model the research methods that you're also going to use in your project. References, all right, so are there references within this article that you might want to then go later on, or that you want to save in general, all right? So, and or just like you might want to code the reference section so you can easily access it also, right, by looking up the reference code, right? And maybe the references to follow up on are specific references, right, that you want to, search, be able to access, download, and perhaps bring into your project. After doing that, all right, you might be able to do things like make a word cloud of the coded terms in your references, right? Identifying which of the coded terms, right, are most prevalent, right? That's described as one kind of, approach to doing the literature review, right? And that may be useful as a representation for your audience, right? But also later on, it's described as a way to kind of look at the similarities between two articles or something like that, right? Because if you're trying to find, right, like, And I don't know, but like also in some ways, right, we want to consider what the use of that is too, right? Like, is it just another like kind of image, right, to show people, or is there like a meaningful kind of of application to this here? But also, right, if you're just kind of like doing exploratory research on kind of finding the right literature, the program is being offered as a tool that allows you to go through that process as well. You might do things like cluster these references into the ones that have the most similar terms in their titles, right? But you might cluster them in the most similar words in their content also. You might set up queries, right, that say, I want to look for these codes, and then I want to look for when these codes are together in the interviews, and then I want to look for when they're together in the interviews, and which of those also discuss this fourth or fifth code too. Right? And so I might want to set up, right, like a query that like allows me to do that over and over again if I bring in new data or new articles into my project. All right. I am going to look at the alumni survey project also. Right. I guess the project also identifies, right, that you can gather your data in a platform like SurveyMonkey, right, which these authors did, right? And the data they gathered, right, were responses to certain questions, but they were open-ended responses, which is what they were analyzing. Right? And then NVivo is going to allow us to, as we're looking at the different cases and codes, right, set up visualizations of things that you might be able to do in other programs too, right? Like year of attendance and the number of people that attended those years, right? It might let you identify, sorry, these locations like this. Now, I guess the kind of things that it also does, all right, is it shows how coding can be distributed, all right? This is hard to read, all right, but this code here says homework. This code here says the commute. This code says the teachers, all right? But underneath those things that are categorized underneath them, all right, which is like carrying heavy books, are things that we're connected to or related to commute. Right? So it's showing, hey, here are these main codes, and here are then these codes that went underneath them, right? Because you coded that information, right? And the NVivo is finding the relationships with those codes themselves here, right? Okay. Also, this report, by the way, does not lay out exactly which visualizations used NVivo and which visualizations used other programs, right? So, like some of these things, right, you can do in other software as well, and it's not clear if these reports, right, only use NVivo to produce these charts. Maybe this is clearer here. Okay, and the last report is on health and well-being of older women, right? And I guess this report showcases a number of more advanced diagrams as well, right? That are depicting relationships that are more complex, right? And these might include relationships that are within themes that are in the responses, right? And the ways in which those themes are connected to one another, right? Now, there are different ways that might be done. Like these might be represented by different classifications or different cases, or, well, these are different like themes. These are likely, like these were layers that the researchers had entered into the program, all right? And NVivo is then taking the different layers and identifying the relationships between them. So this larger layer and these subcodes, right, is then, so these larger 3 codes were put in, right, as those 3 codes. And then these subcodes were put in, and so this diagram, right, is then identifying the relationship between the codes and subcodes as they are present here. All right, I think we're out of time, yes. I appreciate you guys all joining. I appreciate you guys allowing me to review some of that earlier material. And I guess if you guys also have more concrete questions and topics and projects, that's something I'd like to be able to support you on. I guess kind of looking at this is different than kind of playing around with it with the actual data. And so if there are projects that you are working on, please feel free to reach out to me or to the office, to discuss possibilities for modeling your work. Thank you again for joining, and see you guys. Good luck with your rest of your semester. Bye. Thank you, Yan, also for all the work that you put into this. Yes.
And